Welcome back to the Ricky Mathews Show. I really enjoyed that conversation with Caitlin. And, I enjoyed our chats when we were not on the air. She has really progressed to reach her goals as a young woman. And now that she's in a role model role, she's able to give back. And it's been fun to watch her. And I gave her a challenge. If she runs across a young person along the way that she's working with, and who has an interesting story, come join us on the show and let's talk. The more young people we can get engaged in the conversation, the better. But I really enjoyed catching up with her, and she represented Biloxi so well. It's quite amazing, really, when I think about my next guest, Josh Barton, from the Homes of Grace, that I haven't had him on the show already. It's amazing to me. But in a way, and let me go to Josh, and first of all, welcome you, Josh Barton, to the Ricky Mathews Show. How you doing, my friend?
I'm doing excellent. Thank you for having me.
But in a way, you have been here in spirit, because my friend Todd Trenchard, who has an incredible story to tell about the role that Homes of Grace played in his recovery. He has represented you well over many, many conversations about his sobriety. But again, I mentioned to you before we started the show, when you get the opportunity to sit and prepare for a conversation with someone like you, it's a great opportunity to focus and to be reminded that the Homes of Grace has gone through 3 generations of leadership in your family. It's a heck of a story, isn't it?
It really is. And I still like to share with people that come out and they see a lot of miracles that happen out here, and they say, "Thank you so much for your family. Thank you for all you've done." And I often just say, I'm just proud to be a part of something that God's doing, that He does amazing things in spite of us, that we just get to be a part of what He's doing out here. But it really is a blessing to get to see the life transformations that take place in individuals like Todd and others.
Yeah, what was interesting in my conversation with Robert St. John this week, he talked in depth about his sobriety. And what he said was, I mentioned to him that, there are weekend drinkers, and, I might, the way it was before, I might have a beer by the pool, maybe a glass of wine, but that, I'm fine with that. I'm not a big drinker. And he says, when he heard me say that, he says, "Man, I can't even get my head around that, because one's not enough for me. 1,000's not enough for me. Once an alcoholic, always an alcoholic." And he talked really deeply about his sobriety. And in my conversations with Todd Trenchard for the Baco Foundation of South Mississippi, he tells the same story. I mean, it's not something you can go back to. And the way he found sobriety, the number of times he sought treatment. Most people would give up on somebody after the first or second time, to go 10, 15, 20 times to treatment. It's incredible, but you see it. Everyone has an opportunity for redemption. Everyone has an opportunity for recovery. And you've seen so many successful stories in the people who surround you daily over the entire, length of your life, haven't you?
I really have. I mean, we've had over 35,000 men and women through our program over the last 57, 58 years. And probably one of the most radical transformations of anyone that I've seen is actually a guy from the Gulfport area, a guy by the name of Chuck Fayard. He's passed away now, but when Chuck came into our program, there was not a single vein left in his body that he could use to shoot up crack cocaine. And when he came into our program, he lasted about 7 or 8 days. He said, "I can't take it. Can't take it. I'm leaving." And so about a week and a half later, I called to check on him. I said, "How you doing?" He said, "Man, I'm doing a lot better. I'm just smoking crack. I'm not messing with any needles now." And that was his honest to God answer, that he was doing better. But anyway, he radically got his life. He came back into our program, radically changed his life. His house was the crack house. People would come to his house, but he ended up, I could go on and on about how he and his father had not spoken in 8 years. His father moved in with him for him to take care of his father. It's just really cool to see that type of a transformation from someone that, had been using since they were 16, 17 years old, in their 50s. And so, that's just a devastating thing to see someone go through that path as a parent, as you mentioned earlier.
Well, look, let's take a step back.
Sure.
Let's remind people who have not even heard of Homes of Grace, or maybe you've forgotten what it's all about. Home of Grace, if you were going to talk about this incredible addiction recovery program that you put together, what some call as a beacon of hope, how do you talk about it?
Well, we're a 3-month faith-based addiction recovery program, and I'll share more later on about the history of how even it came about, but that's pretty remarkable in and of itself. But we're sitting here, our men's campus is a 160-acre complex, 120-bed men's facility. We have a 42-bed women's facility in Gaucher. And like I said, we have individuals that come in. I think we had 26 different states represented of people that came into our program last year. And so, and most of that is through word of mouth of other alumni that get help and they get on path, and people find out about where did that person get help, and they send their loved one to the Home of Grace. But we have, I think, 9 full-time counselors between the 2 facilities. We have, just medical. We have volunteer doctors and nurses and nurse practitioners that run a medical facility for us. And so a lot of people think about Home of Grace, I think, especially from our region, more as maybe a thrift store. They might see America's Thrift Store as our partner, and they don't think about it more of a first-class addiction recovery program. And so, in fact, our facility here at our men's campus looks like a small junior college. And so that's closer to what what we currently operate. It's a 3-month residential recovery program.
So how many men are there presently?
We probably have 90 men currently in our men's program, probably in the 30 range of our women's program that's about 15 miles from here.
Yeah. So I have lots of questions, but before we get into some of the specifics, why don't we tell people about this incredible organization that has stood the test of time through 3 generations of your family?
So my grandfather, for the older group that's maybe listening today, Brother Bill Barton, he was quite well known in our area. And so he had an amazing story in and of himself. He was born with a cleft palate, cleft lip, no roof of his mouth, felt called to preach at the age of 8. The only problem was nobody in the world could understand him but his own mom because his speech was so bad. But growing up, this is really the seeds that were planted in him for a ministry like this. Growing up, his dad developed an alcohol problem. And so his dad was the type of alcoholic that might could go a month or so without drinking, but when he did drink, he drank the whole truck. And that just devastated my grandfather. And in fact, because of his handicaps, his dad had to work a lot of extra hours to pay for his surgeries as a kid. And so my grandfather, growing up, started feeling like that his dad's alcohol problems was really his fault as a child, because he was thinking, if I didn't have ailments or issues, my dad wouldn't start drinking. And so he actually talked about it still at an early age, probably 9 or 10 years old. It got to the point that it affected him, that he prayed that God would take his life as a child if it meant his dad would stay clean and sober. And so, again, I think those were some deep seeds that were planted in him at an early age. He ultimately went off to college to be a preacher. He really has one of those stories where you can see all the adversities in someone's life and how God used them in an amazing way. But he was told in college that he'd never make it as a preacher because his speech wasn't good enough. And he said he went back to his room and started crying. And he said, I heard the Lord say, you're still on my team. He said, I didn't really know what that meant, but I dried my eyes. I knew I'd be okay if I was on God's team. Well, he ended up pastoring 30-something churches and started the Home of Grace. So he did a lot of amazing things. But throughout, again, those were really the seeds that were planted in him early on. When he started pastoring these churches, he started finding these families that had a husband that was drunk, wife and kids trying to make ends meet, and it just broke his heart. I think it reminded him of his own childhood. And if you think back, 50, 60 years ago, alcohol problems, they really weren't rehabs they were just considered, winos, drunks. They're just kind of outcast. There really wasn't much hope or help for them. And so he had a compassion to make a difference with them. And so he ended up taking 2 people that needed help to a place in Georgia called Victory Homes. It was a small program with about 12 men in it. And when him and my grandmother got there with those two guys, he said the 12 men in that program gathered around the two men that he brought in, prayed with them and encouraged them. And it gave my grandfather chills. And he told my grandmother, he said, we need a place just like this. And so on his way back from Georgia, he told my grandmother, I have a name for our place. And she said, what place? What are you talking about? And he said, we're supposed to call it the Home of Grace and put it somewhere between New Orleans and Mobile. And that's really where the vision of the Home of Grace began, 1965.
What a great story on how this evolved. And what we'll do when we get on the other side is we'll finish this multi-generation story of Home of Grace and give you a little bit more idea of, if you know someone who has who's got challenges. So many people have challenges, and you know, we talk about on this show all the time, you never know what someone's going through. Anyway, you'll have more information about Home of Grace. When we come back, we'll continue our conversation with Josh Barton. Welcome back to the Ricky Mathews Show. I have Josh Barton from Home of Grace, and one of the interesting things about an organization that has stood the test of time and continued to make contributions to the community, especially in the area of drug and alcohol addiction, is that you have to, I've been involved in several nonprofits. I've been chairman of nonprofits. I've started nonprofits, so I know what it's like to have to start a 501(c), et cetera. I've done more than once. But one of the things that's clear, that if you're going to really address the needs of the community, you have to be constantly thinking about 2, 3, 4 years from now, constantly planning. I mean, that's the kind of effort that led to the development of this campus that you guys have today, and then the women's campus over in Gaucher. But there are really no rest, is there? There's always more work to be done.
Absolutely, especially over the last several years, for the people that have recognized the opioid crisis that's happening and the fentanyl. We really recognize that what we're working with is life and death for individuals and for their families. And so every time you see someone that you've been working with fall or fail or have an issue, it just makes you want to go back to the drawing board and say, what more could we have done? And what more could we put together? And so, yes, it's always a hunger to help do everything that we can to give someone the right tools for success.
You mentioned this just a second ago, but opioid addiction in America is rampant. This notion of fentanyl is scary as hell. Every professional from the AG down that I talk to about fentanyl, it's challenging. You saw in the recent trip to Japan, our Secretary of State talked to the president of China about fentanyl and how concerned he is about fentanyl. But my wife and I were watching a show you may or may not have seen it, called Plutonic. It's a series that runs on Apple. It's just a comedy and whatever. But in it, there's a moment where one of the characters snorts what she thinks is cocaine, but it's laced with something else. And I turned to my wife and I said, well, first of all, how would anyone put anything in their nose? They're not exactly sure where it came from. But especially in this world that we're in today with fentanyl and the scare around fentanyl, it's amazing what people are willing to do to get high, isn't it, Josh?
It really is. But nobody wakes up one day and says, I want to be addicted to heroin. I want to be addicted to fentanyl. It's usually small little compromises or small little things that ultimately bring you to a place. And then when you mention, like, why in the world would you even try something at that point? Well, once you're addicted, if you ask one of them, why would you do that? They would say, what would you do for your next breath of air? That's how bad I needed it at that moment. And so it's hard to relate someone that's never had that type of an addiction to how strong of a pull something is for someone that's on that journey.
Yeah, that's a really great way to say it. So, my dad used to often say, you can't rationalize irrationality. Don't even try.
Right.
That people who get in that state, it may not seem rational to us, but to them it is the next logical step in order to address the addiction. And it can be extremely powerful. And whether we're talking about hard drugs like what we just talked about, or whether we're just talking about alcohol, addiction is a really, really tough thing, and it requires a very thoughtful process to bring people through, in your case at Home of Grace, to give people an opportunity for redemption. And you see failures along the way, but you see lots and lots of successes, don't you?
We do. Right now, we have about 6 alumni that have 40 to 60 bed recovery programs themselves in different parts of the country. Last year, we helped replicate Home of Grace in Kokomo, Indiana, called Valley of Grace, from an alumni. And his story is amazing just in and of itself. But when you see someone go from destroying their hometown and their area to now being the lighthouse, when the Indianapolis Press picks up his story and runs with it and people start flocking to him, it's really cool to see the transformation that can take place in someone's life, and then for them to have the hunger to pass that on to others. It's wonderful to be a part of that.
Well, you people hear about, the need to do an intervention for a family member or someone that you love or whatever. But one of the points that Robert St. John said in my conversation this week was that people have to reach a point where they want to get help. But you probably see both, don't you?
We do. You have some that come here because they're court ordered, mama ordered, job ordered, and then you have others that are just at the end and they're wanting it themselves. But sometimes someone that comes into our program that come because other people have kind of heavily encouraged or forced, sometimes within a week or two of their head getting clear, they recognize this is really what I want as well. There is such a fog when they're in their addiction. Sometimes it's hard to snatch them out of that situation. But yeah, it's not the same. Everybody's journey is different.
Well, listen, as I said at the beginning of the show, I'm surprised you and I haven't been already spending time together, but that Todd has done a good job of representing you. But you do a great job representing yourself. So we're going to have you back and we're going to continue the conversation. But I would urge people that if you have any interest in understanding this, whether you're having addiction or someone who you know in love has an addiction, look up the Home of Grace and study them. They've got a great website and they've got a really incredible track record. Anyway, for now, Josh, that's all the time we have. It's been a pleasure to catch up with you.
My pleasure. Thank you.
You bet. This has been Josh Barton from Home of Grace. Have a great day, and we will see you tomorrow.